Can you guys hear me? Because I have a quiet voice. But I'm actually really excited to be here because this is a passion for me. And I do have regular passions, like photography and chocolate. But this is a passion for me because of what my family went through, trying to get an education for my daughter who has POTS and other conditions. So when she was in 9th grade, she missed 117 days of school, all of it excused, often in the hospital, and the school would not send out a tutor. We tried, our doctors at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia tried, and the school refused. They said she didn't qualify. So how did she not qualify? She missed 117 days of school. So my husband and I divided up her schoolwork, not her schoolwork, her subjects. And there's nothing better than relearning 9th grade science, unless it's 9th grade math, and that I gave to my husband. So, and we did our best. But it wasn't just that she didn't have a teacher. It was the mountains of schoolwork. It was so many other issues. And I just thought, how can it be that this is what education for a sick child in this country is supposed to look like? So I started to learn. I read, and I talked to experts, and I took an IEP training, and I went to my state special ed task force meeting. It turns out you can go, but nobody ever does, except me. So I discovered that, of course, that's not what an education for a sick child is supposed to look like in this country, that we actually have some pretty fantastic laws that set up the framework to ensure that kids like ours get an education in the way that works for them. The problem is that there are schools who don't do what they're supposed to do. So when I started Potsibility's Parents 7 years ago, I started to see how many families had the same kind of experience that we did with our school district. And it has been so gratifying to be able to share what I have learned so that other parents have it when they go to advocate for their children's education. So that is why we are here. So today we're going to talk about just the basics of education plans, accommodations and modifications, and what you want to kind of think about as you're starting to think about what your child might benefit from. Common issues that arise. Some tips from the trenches, some resources, finding balance, a note of hope, and if we have time, some questions at the end if I can help you find the answers. So this is a term that can be a really tough term. It was for me until I realized how empowering it is. Because when our kids have been identified as having a disability, it means they have all the protection of federal anti-discrimination law behind them. And there's also special education law, and those are the laws that produce the education plans that are available in our country. These laws apply to all schools that receive federal funds. That means all public schools have to follow these federal laws and regulations. They don't have a choice. Sometimes you might find that a school says they don't do that in their school. They have to if it's a public school. So I'll be referring to these 3 resources through the talk. You'll be getting a handout that includes these resources and terms and some accommodations you might think about. Your PTI is your Parent Training and Information Center. It's a free, federally funded resource of expert information. So they are a great resource to go to find out what your school can and should be doing for your child. Pete Wright of Wright's Law. Pete Wright is a special ed attorney. He teaches at the Law School of William and Mary. And Wright's Law has fantastic information, so much information you have to make sure not to go down 1,000 rabbit holes anytime you're on the website, because there's always something more, and it's all interesting, but it can also be kind of overwhelming. But they have so much information. They do trainings, and they have a lot of books that are really, really good. So if you're really having trouble with your school district, it's fantastic to get these books and have the information on hand, because when you can point to a federal law or regulation and say, I'm a little confused because this says we can do it. It's a very powerful thing to be able to do. And COPA is a Council of Parent Attorneys and Advocates. It's a really great organization. It's only for parents and attorneys and advocates who work on behalf of children with disabilities. So schools aren't allowed in there, and you can go in and post questions and share your information that you might have experience with. And it's a really good place to also look for an attorney, an advocate. You're more likely to find a good one through COPA than just elsewhere. So please know every situation is different, and just always make sure to talk to your PTI or another expert about your own situation. So education plans. These kids might look a little familiar. Our kids are often exhausted, unfocused, overwhelmed, unable to do their homework. These are kids who need an education plan. An education plan can adjust their education. They can have accommodations like reducing homework, excusing absences that are disability related. We have 2 types of education plans, and these actually only apply to public schools. The 504 plan and the IEP, and it really is the impact of the symptoms that determines which is needed. Most children who need an education plan only need a 504 plan. They're much easier to get. They're developed under anti-discrimination law, and they provide access to an equal education. That's actually critically important to remember. If you run into problems with your child not getting the same education as the other kids and your child has a 504 plan, that actually means your school is discriminating against your child with a disability. School can develop a 504 plan on their own, or they can do it with the parents. A lot of schools do include the parents because I think it probably saves them trouble down the line. But even if they don't include you, you can always tell the school what you think your child needs. So to qualify for a 504 plan, a child just needs a condition that substantially limits one or more major life activities. For our kids, that includes neurological, circulatory, digestive functions, concentrating, learning, thinking, communicating, eating, sleeping, standing, walking, working. All of these are actually included in the non-exhaustive list of conditions that should, symptoms that should qualify. So most people don't have trouble getting a 504 plan. Some schools resist even giving these out, even though they don't take a lot for schools to abide by. But if your child is impacted at all by POTS or another chronic condition, if their education is impacted at all, they really should qualify for a 504 plan. An IEP is a lot more difficult to get, an individualized education program. It's like a 504 plan plus. So it's got all the protection of a 504 plan from anti-discrimination law, plus the special ed law that I mentioned before, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. It's pretty extraordinary. It's designed for that child's unique needs. It doesn't matter what any other child in the school has. It's for this one child. A lot more creativity and flexibility in designing the education. There's more regulation, more school accountability, more protection for the child. And the decisions are made by the IEP team, which includes the parents and the child when they reach a certain age. An IEP is always better to get than a 504 plan for all these reasons. To qualify, there's supposed to be a multidisciplinary evaluation from a variety of sources. So some schools actually fight giving IEP plans more than they fight 504 plans because they take resources. They're required to develop education plans based on a child's needs, not on the cost. So because an IEP takes a lot more in terms of time, of money, they tend to fight them. So they might not do the variety of testing or look at the variety of sources that really should be necessary. Excuse me. But parents can actually have input. They should have input about the types of tests and the types of sources that are being included in the evaluation process. And if the disability has an adverse effect on the child's educational performance, then the child needs specially designed instruction, they qualify for an IEP. Both the 504 plan and the IEP are based on students' needs, direct the student's education, and must be followed by teachers. Even teachers in advanced classes have to follow the education plan. So as you think about what types of accommodations and modifications you might like to see on your education plan, it might feel overwhelming because you might have this really sick child. They just can't do anything. What is going to help? And I think it helps to really start from the beginning and just think big picture. How do the symptoms affect their education and what might help? So if they're just not able to finish their homework, they can't, then big picture, they need less homework. And then look at lists of accommodations for ideas. There are a lot of lists out there. You can get ideas to see if you think something's going to be a good match. Make a list of corresponding symptoms and accommodations. You can ask your doctor to review and sign it. We actually asked all of our doctors to review and sign it. It doesn't mean the school has to do anything with that, but it does hold a lot of power. And then discuss it with the school. So, for example, if they're unable to finish their math homework, maybe they could just do half the problems, like the odd-numbered problems. If they can't complete tests in a lot of time, give extra time for tests. That's a very common accommodation. If they need to leave class for the bathroom, they could get a permanent bathroom pass. It'll save them time, embarrassment. So, all schools and parents probably disagree at some point about accommodations that are needed, even if there's a good working relationship. But there are some more common issues that tend to arise in our community of chronic illness. So we talked a little bit about why some schools avoid these appropriate accommodations and education plans. For one, for our kids, their conditions are often invisible and variable. It's hard for a school to understand if the kid was playing volleyball yesterday and they look perfectly fine, why are they not able to be in school today? Why can't they do their homework? Sometimes it's a lack of knowledge about what they're supposed to do. And it could be that's just the way they've always done it at school. That's the way they were trained. Nobody ever thought to look into it more. And then, like I said before, sometimes it's that they're deliberately avoiding the expenditure of resources. So this is one of the most common issues that we tend to see, attendance. Now, if you are having any serious issues with your school about attendance, like truancy, I would absolutely get an attorney. Truancy court does have a reputation for not necessarily understanding disability-related absences, but we shouldn't get to that point. Because if you think about it, if a child with a disability misses school and they get penalized for that, they get charged with truancy, they can't do extracurriculars, they can't go to the prom, or maybe their parents get charged with something, that sounds an awful lot like they're being punished for the disability, like discrimination. So schools are required by federal law to make appropriate adjustments to their attendance policies so that kids with chronic illness who miss school because of that are not going to be held responsible in the same way. They won't be punished. And this quote right here is from the United States Department of Education Office for Civil Rights. They oversee the 504 plans. If your child has a 504, or if they have an IEP, they have the protection of the 504 as well. This quote right here is what you need to talk to your school and say, but the federal government says that we need to make accommodations for their absences. And something that we did was list out the absences and just ask our specialist to sign it and review it. And that way the school would know that the doctor was aware of these, that they were necessary. And that was a fine thing to do. Sometimes you can come to compromises, even if there are things that shouldn't necessarily have to be compromised. But when you're looking at truancy potentially, that was a really good option. Another issue we come across is long-term homebound instruction. Homebound is also called home hospital in some places. And the problem is that most families that this impacts have no idea that this is even an issue. Because Homebound is completely separate from special education. It likely doesn't meet the standards for a student with disability. It's usually very restrictive. Usually maybe a few hours a week for core classes only. Sometimes kids aren't allowed to go to extracurricular activities. Does that sound like the student is accessing an equal education? They're not. So if they have the protection of a 504, and they should, if they are sick enough to be out of school that much, they should at least have a 504. But probably what they need is an IEP with what's called a placement of instruction in the home. The only thing that it shares with homebound education is the fact that tutors come out to the house. Everything else is completely different. There's no restrictions on how much time, what classes. An IEP team designs the education, and that again includes you and your child when they reach between 14 and 16, depending on the state. So that is where the parents and the other members of the team can say, I think Johnny needs more than that 5 hours a week of homebound. Let's give him 8. Let's throw in a couple of electives. I want Johnny to be able to go into school every day for lunch if he's up to it. Go in for clubs. Those are things that he should be able to do. And you can do that with this. And a lot of people are not familiar with this, but this is part of that federal special education legislation, the IDEA that I mentioned. Schools have to follow it. It doesn't mean they have to give your child this placement, but as you sit with the IEP team, if you're in that process, you go through everything, then you get to the placement. If the child can't get their education at school, they should not have this long-term homebound that's not going to appropriately meet their needs. They should have an IEP with instruction in the home. And if the school says they don't do that, well, here we go. It's right here. And one thing that's really important to remember, because this is something that we heard from our school district. Okay, homebound's up. It was maybe a month long. So she has to go back to school. Well, she'd missed 117 days of school. She's not any better. And they just said, well, that's it. That's because we had a school district at that point that was very difficult to work with. And that was completely inappropriate. They should have, under federal law, identified her need as a student with a disability to get an IEP, to have something more than what they were giving her. Another issue we come across a lot is, should we give our medical records to the school, give them complete access? You should talk to an expert yourself. What we were told is that schools probably don't have the expertise to read these medical records and make any association with the education. Doctors don't even have that expertise. There's also private family medical information in there. You shouldn't have to share that with your school. So speak to an expert and consider obtaining a letter from your doctor instead. Only having conversations between the school district and the doctor that include you. That's only if you feel that it's necessary. We were at a point that it was very necessary that we be a part of the conversations. There have been schools that have been known to misrepresent what a doctor said. And then the entire rest of the planning process for the education plan is strongly impacted by that. And you can consider adjusting the medical release that you signed for the school. We made our own. But what we did was make sure that we show that we really did want to work with the school, that we're not trying to be obstructive. We just have a different idea of what we are comfortable with and what we should do. So these are the tips from the trenches. Bring food to meetings. That's actually such a great tip, because it's really hard for people connect over food. You know, it's kind of a basic level of connection. And they also don't get hangry. If you're in a long meeting, it's a really great thing to do. We had a really long meeting one time. We brought the food, And nobody touched it. And then it went on and on because we don't go away. And then suddenly everyone's reaching over, and suddenly actually everybody just seemed more relaxed. This is something I did. My empowering song, that is my school's ringtone when they call me, is Radioactive by Imagine Dragons. I don't know if you know the words. You should listen. It either makes me laugh or it makes me feel really strong, whatever I kind of need at the moment. But it does really help. So communication. Pete Wright of Wright's Law talks about schools being the gatekeepers of education. And he says that we have to keep the gates open, if at all possible. We have to do everything we can, even if it gets really tough. Now, I just want to stop for a moment and say there are some really great school districts. There are really great teachers. I'm a huge fan of teachers. And we actually ended up with a really fantastic IEP team after some time. So we want to be calm and polite. Maybe get on a first name basis, and it makes it a lot more personal. Pete Wright recommends doing this Miss Manners plus Columbo approach. As I wrote this, I realized our kids probably have no idea what that means. But he says always be really polite and always know how to get your hands on the information you need, like that regulation I mentioned, but just not in an expert way. Well, this says this. Really more kind of a bumbly way. Well, I found this. It might be helpful. Because it doesn't back them up against the wall. And it's really important. Everybody needs a way to back down gracefully. And the people you work with at schools are no different. If there's a negative dynamic, if applicable, try having your other parent communicate. This was helpful. Just my husband. I was usually the one writing and calling, and that went very well, generally. But if we're just kind of stuck in a loop, then just someone else stepping in can be a good thing. And if both parents are involved, you can send emails from both. So it doesn't sound like it's just coming from one, stressed mom who's overreacting. It's coming from the both of you. And of course it shouldn't be perceived that way, but we know it generally is. Bring a spouse, a partner, a friend to the meeting. Always. You don't want to go alone, even if they just sit quietly and take notes. Because if a school is of the mind, they might have a lot of people there. It's a method of intimidation. I once went with a friend to an IEP meeting, and they had something like 13 people there. And as we went around, I asked them to all just sign what their role was. They were almost all secretaries. Yeah, they had been brought to intimidate. There was no other reason. Bring printed information about your child's illness from reputable sources. When I bring things that are from, say, our doctor at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, or something from Mayo Clinic, something from Vanderbilt. Those are names that people tend to just respect right off the bat. Bring charts or graphs. Those are really impactful. To show the change in grades, the change in attendance. Bring a profile of your child. This was from Pete Wright. This is Sarah. Not really. All the pictures, I think, look a lot like the same girl. But you want to, if your child's not there, and even if they are, you want to make your child real to the people sitting in that room who've probably never met her. You want them to see her personality, her loves, her symptoms, her struggles. It fleshes out your child. About the process. There's a really powerful tool that we have. It's called prior written notes as part of the IEP process. Schools have to tell you in writing at certain points through the process what they're doing or what they're not doing. One of those points is when they refuse an IEP evaluation. They just say, oh, your child doesn't qualify for an evaluation. Usually they don't put that in writing. They are supposed to, by federal law, put that in writing and say why they're refusing, why the child doesn't qualify. And you will likely see, if you ask them to put it in writing, that they won't, because they know they shouldn't be doing it. Write attendance only next to your signature at an IEP meeting when you sign the attendance. I don't think it happens very often, but there are certainly schools who might misuse the signature. I think that was a tip from Wright's Law. Be aware of the IEP process and timeline. You don't want to get overwhelmed. It's a big process. Maybe you can learn about it in steps, but the timeline is really important because your school is supposed to do certain steps within a certain time period, and that's for your child's protection. But there are certain things that we have to be aware of too, like responding in our timely manner, or else it means, for example, if we disagree with the IEP evaluation and we don't send a written rebuttal within the time frame, it actually means we agree with the evaluation. If we don't reject the IEP in the time period, it goes into place. We can't just let them sit. Be aware. This is actually, I think, one of the most serious issues that, again, parents are not aware of. Even if they are nice, be wary and educate yourself. I think that's one of the most serious issues. That was one of our most serious issues. Don't threaten to get a lawyer unless you plan to follow through. That might work with some school districts. Other school districts be like, okay, we're done. Just get back to us with your attorney. All attorneys and advocates are not the same. We had an experience with an attorney, and then we went to a different attorney. Advocates actually don't need any training or licensing, which is shocking. Anybody can call themselves an advocate, and they may mean well, and they may know a lot, but they may not know enough. So you might try finding one through COPA or through PTI. I think you're more likely to find one who is better through one of those organizations. Be careful when you sign basic forms at school at the beginning of the school year, because those often give the school the right to contact your doctor at any point. And that's supposed to be, in our minds, for an emergency. If you don't have a chronically ill child, that's for an emergency. But if you're considering not allowing them to have all the records, to have that easy access to your doctor, you want to be aware of what you already signed. Document everything in writing. Anything they say, anything you say or request, if it's not written down, it doesn't exist. So even just following up with a nice polite email, it was nice to talk to you, I understand this is where we are, list it out. Don't sign anything until you look very carefully at it. Our response to the IEP evaluation report was 13 pages long. That took days of me going back over it and finding so many things that were of concern that I didn't notice initially. It would be an easy thing. In fact, I've seen parents just sign things and send it right back. You don't know what's in there until you really sit down and take some time to go through it. And even if they tell you verbally, it means something different. The only thing that matters is the form you signed. So don't ever let them just tell you, those nice people, oh, well, we have to do this, but it doesn't mean anything. They're asking us for our signature. It means something. And that's where that little phrase, if a team member won the lottery, is actually someone at our school who said that, about it being very clear, written down. Because if a team member wins the lottery and moves off to Switzerland, they're not there to explain, oh no, I meant something else. So that's something you can always use with your school too. Well, gosh, what if they leave this position? We need to make sure that everybody else understands what you meant. Mm-hmm. There are easy ways to disagree without appearing combative. So these are some common misconceptions. Often people think a school has to follow a doctor recommendation. They don't. It's great if a school does, but they don't have to. So the school does not have to follow doctor recommendations. And students with disabilities can qualify for an education plan with good grades, participate in extracurricular activities, and take advanced classes if they otherwise qualify. All three of those are issues we see quite a bit in the parent group, and we experienced all three ourselves. So those are things that are actually specifically addressed by the federal government. And if you were to Google any of those issues and put in like through the OCR, the Office of Civil Rights website, you'd be able to find these specific issues in the federal reference. And again, then you would say to your school, oh, well, I found this. And they might say, well, we don't do that here. Really? Because I thought you had to. Again, you don't say it like that. Sometimes I feel a little bit snarky. Students don't need a diagnosis to get an education plan. A lot of people think they do. But a lot of kids never learn what they have. They don't have a name for it. It's the symptoms that count. You're never going to see that a kid gets a plan because of a diagnosis. Because even within a diagnosis, you're going to have some kids who need a plan and some who don't. They don't need to do a different type of plan first. That's not a 504 plan or an IEP. That actually keeps the school from identifying that child as a child with a disability who has all the protection of all the federal anti-discrimination laws behind them. You don't need to agree to every evaluation test proposed by the school. Parents are supposed to be a part of the decision-making process about what testing is done, what is needed for the IEP evaluation. And if there's something that concerns you, for example, if your school is really trying to say that your child's symptoms, they're psychiatric, they're not physical like your doctor says, I think it's really important to be aware of what the evaluations are, because in the best of all worlds, yeah, let's do that evaluation. Let's see what emotional help the child might need. But if it's a school that's looking for a reason to not do what your kid needs, to not do what your doctor says, you do want to be careful. Wright's Law does have a really good book. It lists out all the all the different types of tests and what they are looking for. It's funny that is something that excites me, but it does. So this last one is just if you have a really difficult situation with your school. Don't be surprised if the phones, the voicemail, the email stop working. It's actually kind of tragic. They must have a really, really bad technology system. As soon as they get something from you that seems to indicate that you might be getting an attorney or that you might know that your child should have more, sometimes you get nothing back. But what Pete Wright says actually is that we still go ahead and keep writing our polite emails that tell what happened, because he says that becomes the history of the entire situation, the written history. And he has seen due process go the way of the child because of the really good written history that the parents did. Again, don't be surprised if they bring a lot of people to the meetings or that they assert symptoms are psychiatric. But there are things that we can do and say that are really good and really powerful. Please show me where that is written. I don't know how many times I have said this. I have never once been shown where it's written because it doesn't exist. We might have been told, well, we can't do that because our district doesn't allow it or the state doesn't allow it. Well, could you please show me where that's written so that I can better understand this process? I like using the term variable cognitive dysfunction instead of brain fog. Brain fog sounds like nothing. This sounds like the debilitating symptom that it is. And there are also some really good, there's a really good article written by somebody from Vanderbilt about cognitive dysfunction in POTS. So that is always something that you can give to your school. I like to refer to it not as POTS. And I know there are other conditions here, but I think POTS is a really unfortunate acronym. It just doesn't sound serious. I like to say neurological condition, medical condition. And if the school says they can't do something with a 504 plan, oh, we can't do that with a 504. But the child needs it. So ask about an IEP evaluation. Name drop and term drop. When we were seeing our doctor, Dr. Boris at the Children's Hospital Philadelphia, that's what I would write. Our cardiologist at the Children's Hospital Philadelphia, who teaches at the medical school of the University of Pennsylvania, because we were actually having an issue where there was a local physician brought in as the school district doctor who was making determinations about my child and what the school was going to do and refuting the diagnosis refuting the doctor's recommendations. We had a doctorate CHOP. It was so inappropriate. She had never met my kids or examined them. She had never seen my daughter's records. So that can be helpful. Things we can do. We can get an independent IEP evaluation. The school doesn't have to abide by it, but they do have to consider it. And if your independent evaluation really differs from the school's evaluation, that can be a really powerful thing as you go down the line. You can request that the school pay for one. They may or may not. But that's something you can also talk to your PTI or someone at COBA about. You can bring your child to the IEP meeting or not. The pro is it's really good to learn self-advocacy. The con is if it's a difficult situation, then it can be a really difficult thing for the child to see. You always want to appear cooperative and be cooperative. It's not that we're trying to obstruct what they want to do. It's really that we want to do it in a way that we think is appropriate. So you want to express in person and in writing that you want to work with the school for the benefit of your child. Just always appear cooperative even when you're disagreeing with what they want to do. So school can look many ways. Full day, part day, it goes down the line. And options that include teaching subjects in larger chunks and giving fewer assignments, like you might have with Homebound or an IEP with instruction in the home. It was actually someone at our school who told us that's actually very similar to how kids are taught in college. So that was really, really good for us to hear because we thought our daughter would be at such a disadvantage. At a point, we didn't think college would be possible. And knowing that she was actually going in, knowing the way that she was going to be taught, that was a really good thing. You can do a combination of different things. And there's no right or wrong. It's only what's right for your family and your child. So these are some resources. They'll be in your handout. There are a lot. Again, you don't want to get overwhelmed, but it's definitely a good idea to check with something that is an expert resource and to check with more than one resource. Someone shared something recently with me that had a lot of good information, but she had something really critical wrong. And it was well intended, but it wasn't correct. And there are probably a lot of parents running around with that information, unfortunately. So just always check at least a couple. And again, don't feel like you have to learn everything at once. It can be so huge and so overwhelming. So you can just kind of take it in parts. And again, every situation is different. Talk to an expert. And I want to take a moment to talk about finding balance because as parents of kids with chronic illness, this is a really big thing. Parenting a child with chronic illness is hard. Some of us have more than one child with chronic illness. Some of us have health issues ourselves. Then if you throw in trying to get an education for your child, it can be incomprehensibly hard. So you have to take a few moments. You have to take some time for yourself. Just breathe, take a walk, get coffee with friends. Because you can't run on empty batteries. And you can't help your kids with empty batteries. But even more importantly, you matter. It matters that you feel that there is some balance in your life. And I want to finish on a note of hope because that daughter who missed 117 days of school, we had to fight so hard to get her an education, and we didn't even know if she'd be able to go to college. And we found what worked for her. And she started college with one class and then two, and worked her way up. She graduated last May. So you can find what is right for your child, for your family. You can move past what is happening at your school and find your own hope.